Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the three books that I read in February. The first of which is The Showings of Julian of Norwich, edited by Denise N. Baker. For a book this small, it felt very large to me, especially because it took a really long time to read. There was a lot to consider, not just in the main text, but the several commentary contained in the back. But first, I'll begin with the author. So, Julian of Norwich was an anchoress and medieval mystic. She is the first known woman to have written a book in English. In 1373, Julian was so sick that she assumed she would die, and a priest was called to administer last rites. But instead of dying, that night she had a series of visions that lasted into early morning, and she then quickly recovered from her illness. She then spent the next 20 years meditating on the visions and their possible meanings, which culminated in her writing this work. This text is a Middle English translation based on the Paris manuscript that was scribed sometime between 1580 and 1650 of the long text. I was expecting this to be a modern English translation, so I was really surprised and a bit scared when I finally cracked it open. While there are apparently editions with the original text on one page and a modern English translation on the opposite page, I'm glad that I, however unwittingly, ordered this copy from the library. Once you get used to the feel for the language and spelling, reading the Middle English translation makes for an almost mesmeric experience, which is strengthened by Julian's repetitious language. Although I was raised very Catholic, I have not been a practicing anything for a long time. I think I had added this book to my TBR as part of a list of female mystics that I had encountered somewhere online. Anyway, even though I'm very much no longer Catholic, I did find Julian's feminine and even sometimes gender ambiguous take on the Holy Trinity really refreshing. I didn't know such a thing existed. It's no secret that Catholicism is an incredibly patriarchal religion. Perhaps if women were allowed any authority in the church, I would still be Catholic. Who knows? So I really wanted to talk about what it was like to be an anchoress in the 14th century, because I think it's really fascinating. An anchorite, if you're a man, or an anchoress, if you are a woman, is someone who has decided to seek, and I'm quoting Julian here, quietness and rest from all the world's din, that nothing may hinder them from hearing the voice of God. So, once a woman decided to become an anchoress, a requiem mass would be sung at the church in her honor, and a procession would lead her to her cell, which was attached to the church. She would then have been given extreme unction, which is a Catholic sacrament given only to the terminally ill or dying, as she was now considered to be almost literally dead to the world. Once an anchoress had entered her cell, she was allowed to leave only upon her death or excommunication. I mean, it was assumed that she would be there until she died. Her cell would have been attached to the side of the church, like I said, but there would be a window in the wall so that she could watch the daily mass, and there was also a window facing the street so that she could listen to those who wanted her counsel or request her prayers on their behalf. So I wanted to quote a few lines from Julian's book just to give you the gist of what some of her visions consisted of. Here's the first description. The great drops of blood fell down from under the garland like pellets seeming as it had come out of the veins. The plenteousness is like to the drops of water that fall off the eaves of a house after a great shower of rain that falls so thick that no man may number them. Essentially, lots of blood. I wanted to note that Julian described her visions as showings because she literally saw them before her eyes. This was not something that she believed that she experienced just in her mind. And she called them lively and hideous and dreadful and sweet and lovely. Here is one other vision. Christ showed a part of his passion near his dying. I saw the sweet face dry and bloodless, his nose shriveled and dried, his sweet body waxed brown and black, and by the process of time, the pain dried up all the lovely spirit of Christ's flesh. Nice. As Julian contemplated these visions throughout the following years, she became... Hold on, cat fight. Sorry. So as Julian contemplated these visions throughout the following years, she became insecure of the meanings that she had extrapolated from her experience. She found it difficult to reconcile the message she received of all shall be well with the teachings of the church. At that time, it was assumed that anybody who was considered non-Catholic would be cast into hell for all eternity, which didn't really jive with the sense of love and peace that Julian got from her visions. The last thing I wanted to bring up was that she saw Jesus as brown-skinned, which is presumably how he would have looked. Here is one quote I picked out. The brownness of his fair face with the seemly blackness of his eyes was most according to his somberness. I do wonder, when did the church stop portraying Jesus as a Middle Eastern man? I mean, is this a fairly modern thing, or did that racism start really long ago? I don't know. If you know, please tell me. And finally, I wanted to bring up the varied spelling of words throughout the text. During Julian's time, it was a normal thing to spell a word one way on one page and another way on another page. There was no established system for grammar or spelling, and this sometimes leads to really cute sentences, like this one. The Lord that sat solemnly in rest and in peace. But the caveat being that peace is spelled like peas, as in Peas. It's really adorable. Anyway, I recommend this book to the very few who are interested in the topic, but I mean, it's not a great general recommendation. Little Big by John Crowley was first published in 1981 and is summarized thus on Goodreads. It is the story of 4 generations of a singular family living in a house that has many houses on the magical border of an otherworld. Ooh, intriguing. So this is one of those books that is very difficult to describe. You kind of just have to tell people to read it, hope they do, and leave it at that. But I will give it a shot. So this book is considered a fantasy, but it's a lot more than like that. It might be even more than fantasy, a family epic. There are a number of characters we follow throughout the book, and it can be really easy to lose track of who is who, especially because those characters rarely, if ever, leave the family home and the surrounding property. The few characters that do venture out go to an unnamed city, which we can pretty safely assume is New York. The prose is sharp yet subtle. Crowley is certainly a writer's writer. I actually felt this so much at times that I thought the prose came off as too considered, which is really unfair because any good author is going to give a lot of thought to their work, but that's just how I felt. So that's really the only negative I can assign to the novel, other than it comes off as a bit racially insensitive at times. The fantasy aspect of the novel is subtle, yet all-encompassing. I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but have you ever walked through a forest and everything seems to be like a little too alive and a little conscious of you being there? That's kind of what this book feels like. And just like this is not an easy book to describe, it's not an easy book to understand. I expect that if I were to read it again, I would realize I had missed like a lot of small things. I will give you a taste of the prose and then move on to the last book I wanted to talk about. She walked through the graveyard, not knowing it to be such. Lilac wondered at the big carved stones placed at random here and there like giant forgotten toys. Beneath her feet, beneath the snow and black leaves and earth, stiff bones relaxed, and hollow chests would have sighed if they could have, and old attitudes of attention and expectancy, undissolved by death, were softened. And, as sleepers do when a troublesome dream passes or a bothering noise, the crying of a cat or a lost child ceases, those asleep there rested more deeply and slept at last, truly as Lilac walked above them. So I really recommend this book with the expectation that some people will love it and some people will hate it, as that seems to be the trend. Moving on to the last book. The Poetics of Space. The Poetics of Space was first published in 1958 by Gaston Bachelard and translated from the French by Maria Jolas. Wow, what a magical book. I was not expecting it to be what it is. Bachelard calls himself in this a philosopher of adjectives, and he wrote many books with delightfully imaginative titles such as The Psychoanalysis of Fire and Earth and Reveries of Repose. I think Wikipedia gives a fairly precise description of what this book contains, even if it's put a little dryly. Bachelard applies the method of phenomenology to architecture, basing his analysis on lived experience in architectural places and their contexts in nature. He focuses especially on the personal, emotional response to buildings, both in life and in literary works, both in prose and in poetry. He is thus led to consider spatial types such as the attic, the cellar, and drawers. So, The Poetics of Space is a book at its most basic level about how people inhabit those spaces, both emotionally and physically. But anybody who has read this will know it's about a lot more than that. For anybody who often thinks in images or is an enthusiastic daydreamer, this book is very much for you, especially because Bachelard puts into words the process of daydreaming that I thought was impossible to describe. It felt a bit like finally being given a diagnosis to a mild but persistent physical ailment that you had been resigned to believing would always be a mystery to yourself. Not only does Bachelard pull quotes from various poetic works in order to support his ideas, but he writes really beautifully himself. A series of images which may be considered the houses of things, drawers, chests, and wardrobes. What psychology lies behind their locks and keys? An empty drawer is imaginable. It can only be thought of, and for us who must describe what we imagine before what we know, what we dream before we verify, all wardrobes are full. I would love to read a bit more to you from this book, but I think there are so many passages that really resonated with me, and it was such a joy to discover them that I will leave this opportunity open to you as well. Needless to say, I very much recommend this book to anyone who is interested. If you do plan on picking this up, do yourself a favor now and become familiar with the philosophical definitions for phenomenological and dialectic. You would get very drunk very quickly if you were to take a drink anytime those words are used throughout this book. Also, be aware that Bachelard's introduction to his text is dense with philosophical jargon. Know that it becomes infinitely more readable and really takes on an intimate conversational style as the book progresses. Before I forget, in the really, really off chance that anyone watching this is fluent in both French and English, please translate a work or two mentioned in this book. Bachelard cites a novel by Henry Bosco that, as far as I can tell, there was no English translation for. That sounds really interesting. Not a big ask at all, just, translate a book on your day off. Anyway, that's all for today. Bye.